Welcome to the Healing Grove podcast. I'm Dr. Kristen Ryman, an integrative holistic family physician, author of Life After Lyme, and host in this virtual space of learning, healing, and growing. I believe humans are like trees, and our physical limb is only one of many. Health on all limbs of the tree, emotional, conceptual, social, spiritual, is absolutely required for the whole tree that is you to be vibrantly well. I created the Healing Grove podcast as a place to showcase some of the world's best integrative and holistic medicine, to expose you to transformative tools and mindset shifts for all limbs of your tree. I hope you enjoy our conversation in the Healing Grove today as much as I enjoyed having it. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Healing Grove podcast. I'm really excited to introduce you today to my new friend, Dr. Chris Winfrey. So everyone, Dr. Chris Winfrey is a neuropsychiatrist based in Marlton, New Jersey, so just over the state line from me, whose innovative work bridges traditional psychiatry and integrative medicine to address very complex mental health challenges. His expertise spans psychoanalysis, functional medicine, integrative medicine, and environmental medicine, giving him a holistic perspective on mental and neurological health. In his practice, Dr. Winfrey combines somatic and psychological therapies to rehabilitate the brain and restore mental functioning. And he works and has success with patients of all ages experiencing conditions ranging from traumatic brain injuries to mild and severe cognitive impairment to PANS and PANDAS, depression and anxiety, and all the conditions that affect the brain and mental well-being. And what really sets him aside and why I really wanted to interview him today is his deep commitment to understanding the intersections of culture, faith, and psychiatry. With additional training in racial and cultural psychiatry, he's delivered impactful presentations on these topics in diverse settings, and his work on bridging faith traditions and psychiatric care has been featured at the APA, international meetings, and within faith communities as well. Currently, he's delving into groundbreaking research on microbial and toxic influences on psychology and psychiatric conditions, which is a nice overlap with the work I do with Lyme disease and why I'm super excited to pick his brain today. And he offers a fresh perspective on the root causes of mental health challenges. So, Dr. Winfrey, thank you so much for agreeing to be on the Healing Grove podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Cool. So I want to start by just asking you what led you into this niche that you exist in. It's sort of a, you and I both found our way into sort of non-traditional sections of medicine. And I'm always curious to know from my colleagues kind of how did that happen?
It's a really good question. My own sort of interface with this sort of problem, and I think this is how many of us either come in some sort of personal experience directly or indirectly. I was exposed to these denizens that we treat in mold and Lyme and bar, and I was operating, in my capacity as a physician, and I began to have experiences and symptoms that didn't make sense. And I began to go from one doctor to the next and really didn't get the answers that I was looking for. My cognition at one point had became so impoverished. In medical school, we had to remember an entire textbook in a week almost for an exam. And so I was used to processing large volumes of information, remembering, large volumes of concepts and ideas and things for an exam. And I got down to the point where I could barely write an email. And I remember going to a neurologist that said to me, well, maybe we should get a neuropsych testing. I said, well, how do you think that's going to, really change management and things of that nature? And she said, well, I don't know. Let's see what they say, and maybe they can give you some tips on how to remember. I said, no, that's not acceptable. I'm a physician, and I used to have a real strong memory, and now I can barely remember just what I had to eat earlier today. I said, this is unacceptable. And so it was an experience for me that was very shocking. I had an opportunity to kind of see what patients experienced. I had not been on that side of the fence in that capacity to be blown off, to be given made up explanations and things that I knew didn't make sense. Even from an ethnic point of view, I remember my white count dropped and I saw a doc who told me, you know, I think you might have benign ethnic leukopenia. So what is that? Now, I had heard of that, and I'm familiar with these sort of racialized medicine and things, but I just wanted to see what they would say. And they said, well, you know, how Black people can have, you know, a lower white count. And I said, hmm. I said, so what you're telling me is if I was a white person and I had a lower white count, that would be unacceptable, and you'll find out what the problem is and, you know, try to figure out how to treat. But because I'm a Black person, me having a lower white count is okay because I guess what Black people are stronger and can handle more problems and suffering and things. So I said,
Okay, hold the phone. First of all, I am shocked and I've never heard of this term. Is this something that you learned in medical school or that you learned through your other training? Because to me, that's not a real diagnosis. What's the history of that particular diagnosis?
So, so this sort of subgroup of medicine called racialized medicine, and there are these sort of diagnoses and culture-bound syndromes and ways in which you think about laboratory. Another example that is you look on a CMP and you see that there's a GFR there for African Americans and then everybody else non-African Americans. And so you're like, well, what's so different about African American kidneys compared to non-African American kidneys? There need to be two different calculations of scores there. And so you have that, and then there's other sort of conditions, like you have a alopecia in women, and, you know, kind of have a ethnic sort of label there. Um, and you're right, these are like made up diagnoses in a way. They have some steam behind it because through persuasion and coercion and to some degree, but also I think in the when there's lack of strong evidence of something and people want to fill in the gap, to some degree, the ego doesn't like to exist in the space of uncertainty. And so we're trying to fill it in with something. And this along the way has made sense to some people. And it kind of go all the way back to a guy named Cartwright who came up with all these sort of racialized terms for Black people and how white people were more superior because of the head structure and the skull and respiratory capacity. Even other terms like droptilomania, when the slave would run away from the slave masters because he had some sort of psychological condition. It goes all the way back, and there's all these terms and all these concepts that kind of continue to exist. And so I looked at that particular physician. I said, you know, you're full of shit, right? I was, you know, that makes absolutely no sense. And he just looked at me and he's like, well, that's just what I was taught. And I said, listen, never really say this again. This doesn't make, there's no science behind it. It makes absolutely no sense. If my white count has dropped, so we need to be investigating why. And to tell me it's just low because I'm Black makes absolutely no sense.
Oh, I'm so glad you provided that feedback. And hopefully that stuck. And I really want to get back to your story, Chris, but before we do, I feel the need to just, are there resources for people who want to learn more about this particular issue? Like, let's say I'm a Black person, I'm going to the doctor and I feel like I'm being given a BS diagnosis. Is there a place to learn kind of where to push back? Are there any diagnoses that are higher? I mean, of course, I have the list in my head of what we learned in med school about those things, like sickle cell, for example, like are going to be higher in people of that ethnic background. But is that wrong too? Like, where's the kind of rule book for what to know about this for people who have no clue?
You know, there's a person, by the time we're done here, I'm going to remember it. It's her name. She's over in Penn. Um, mm, by the time we're done, I'm gonna come up with it. So it's she's over in Penn, and I think she's in law and in sociology. She's written a couple books on this, and kind of details the history of racialized medicine and talks about it in great detail.
Okay, cool.
And I think, you know, reading through that would be kind of give a great framework.
Perfect. Thank you. So we will provide a link to that, whether it's remembered during this podcast or later. We'll figure it out together and we'll put it on the show notes. Thank you for that. Okay, back to your story. I want to hear what happened next because you're suffering and you're being given some BS diagnosis. What happens next?
Yeah, so I went from, you know, neurology to nephrology to pulmonology to ENT, um, to cardiology to gastroenterology to PM&R. You know, I had went around the block, um, and I I remember I was going for a nerve conduction test and an EMG and nerve conduction test because I was having these neuropathies as well. And um, um, the doctor who saw me and he was like, um, I don't think you're going to figure out what's going on, you know. Um, and and I remember thinking, walking away, it was like, wow, what a really crappy thing to say to somebody. And I thought about that for a moment. I said, he must have felt like I'm not going to be able to figure out what's going on because he hasn't figured out what's going on. And so he's kind of projecting it onto me and his own inadequacy, couldn't tolerate the idea. And then I thought to myself, it was one of the first moments I came to a better appreciation of evil. And I thought it is a great deal of evil to allow someone to suffer, cause someone to suffer, when I try to help somebody alleviate their suffering if you can. That when it comes to health consequences and things of that nature, I think this is one of the grave ways that we suffer. And as physicians, it is an act of evil to pronounce or project onto someone some sort of state of depravity or deterioration in a way that leaves them hopeless and helpless and unable to resolve. I think this is a sign of sadistic evil in my mind at this point. I had never thought of it that way before this experience. And so because of that, I'm very careful not to pronounce to somebody, you're going to be like this for the rest of your life, or like if I don't understand. I mean, obviously I have to go with, the availability of medicine at the time, but uh, there are certain things I think we got to be cautious about how we speak about that sort of thing.
Yeah,
So
no, it can become like a curse.
yeah, absolutely. Exactly. And so so what I ended up doing, I sat down, I said, okay, I'm a physician. I understand medicine to some degree. Let me sit down with my labs and everything. So I started combing through everything and I started seeing things that were missed or not quite highlighted. And so I started researching and reading. And that's kind of eventually how I got to functional medicine, integrative medicine, environmental medicine, etc. I just kind of started training more. I went back and got more training. And then that's when I found out, I was exposed to mold. I moved out of my office that I was in. Um, and then I just kind of kept going down the rabbit hole until I eventually got here. And then I said, well, I wonder how many of my patients are struggling with these similar sort of things. And so I started, talking to them about it and then slowly started moving down this path.
So at that time, were you in just sort of before you went down the integrative medicine path and were sick yourself, were you just kind of doing standard psychiatric medicine? Did you have, you said, okay, so the holistic framework was really built out of necessity as you had to kind of delve into those things to get yourself well.
Yes.
Wow. And
Yes.
then what did you find as you started looking for these things in your patients?
I started finding, um, Dietrich Kleinhardt has this sort of model where he talks about how infections and toxins and emotional conflicts kind of go together in a very energetic way. And it became a helpful model for me. So in psychiatry, here I am working with people who have emotional conflicts to some degree. And I have been, trained to really address that. And so people will get better maybe up to about 30, 40%. And I was getting stuck and I was plateauing. And so my supervisor would tell me, we just got to go deeper and you got to go longer. But I was like, something's not right. That doesn't make sense. And so I think this model by Dietrich Kleinhardt really began to help me understand that you can only go so far with emotional conflicts if you're not addressing the infections and then toxins simultaneously. And then I talked to some of my other colleagues who are not psychiatrists, where they have people who come in and they say, hey, I want to deal with these toxins and infections. And my colleagues say, hey, but you also need to deal with your emotional conflicts. And they can't quite understand why they're suggesting it. Like, I don't really have anything to address or deal with, whatever. I just want to get this Lyme under control or whatnot. And so I began to understand with my patients why I was kind of hitting a wall with them to some degree is that we weren't addressing those infections and toxins simultaneously, and that they had become energetically locked in and that we was hitting that wall. And so once we started addressing those other two arms of that triangle, people started making progress beyond what I had seen before. And something changed in me and I could never go back. I had never really believed, although I'm a physician, although I came into this healing profession, I had never seen healing. I,
Hmm.
and because I had never seen it in my own personal life, in my life, and patient life, I didn't quite ever fully believe in it. And I didn't know that I didn't believe in it until I actually saw it. And then looked at my attitude of how I was before. And this experience helped me usher in a new belief system of what is possible for people, and then the leaps and bounds that people can make, and how limiting I was before, and how I wasn't really helping my patients and myself kind of get there. And now when I talk to other physicians and people, I can hear where I once was. And I can think, oh my God, you don't really believe that people can get well. You don't really believe in healing. And it's a far-fetched idea to think a physician doesn't believe that, but I don't think a lot of us do.
No, what you just said is so profound. I'm like on the verge of tears because you're really right. I mean, we talk a lot about how the modern medical system is all about like a disease model, right? And we're just band-aiding symptoms and looking to kind of find the thing that's going to match up to the drug that's going to kind of keep the symptoms at bay. And a lot of people feel better enough that they think that's just what health is, right? We were talking about that spectrum earlier. Do you want to show that beautiful spectrum you pulled up for me? I think it's a really helpful construct for people because you're right. A lot of people have never experienced healing, including physicians. So why would that be their goal for you if they don't even know that exists?
Absolutely. So, for your listeners, one of the things I came to, understand that a lot of medicine, and for many people who are struggling to understand the medical system, our medical system shift a long time ago when it was much simpler, where you had that one doctor um, who can come to your home and treat your entire family. The concept of family physician, where he could carry everything he need in that one medicine bag. um, those days are you know, um, over. And medicine has become far more complex. There's no way one doctor can kind of handle everything. And that doctor also at that time, um, worked on a sort of preventative model, and, really medicine used to encourage a wellness model. Then, because the industrialization, infiltration of toxicities into our environment, into our air, into our water, into cosmetic products and different things of that nature, endocrine disruptors, all the different products and things, plastics that we're using, it was just a very different world that we're using now and that we're in now, has disrupted our immune system, has then ushered in chronic toxicity, chronic infections in a way that we have never really experienced them. And then we're seeing things like autoimmunity and other sort of things on the rise in ways that we've never seen, autism on the rise in the ways that we've never seen before. And so medicine has, really converted over into this sort of acute illness model. And we have the best acute system in the world, but we don't have the best chronic system in the world to deal with chronic illness. And so most physicians are on this side of this sort of paradigm here and thinking about how do you manage disease, how do you manage poor health. And so a person who on this sort of illness wellness continuum at a 0, 1, 2 have, disease, some zero over here close to the death. And that means they have multiple medications, poor quality of life, and they have limitations in functionality. A lot of times where a physician's trying to move people from the 0, 1, 2, 3 range, um, at best, oftentimes into this 4, 5, 6 range, where symptoms have been significantly reduced. We call a response a 50% reduction in symptoms, where nutrition maybe is inconsistent, exercise sporadic, health not as high priority here. And for many people, once they are with a 0 or 1, they feel a lot better in the 4, 5, 6. And for some of them, they feel the best ever, and they kind of stop. And what I've come to find is hard to get people over into this wellness column where people say, I'm moving out of an illness mindset, I'm moving out of a disease sort of paradigm, and I'm moving into wellness, and I'm going to move into prevention, I'm going to move into advocacy, I'm going to move into lifestyle changes, I'm going to move into a different mindset that's looking not only to just get by, but to thrive. So how do I move from survival to thriving? Is this sort of spectrum here, and that's a mindset shift. And what I found is, to some degree, to get there, you also need to see other people there. Um, you also need to see who your leaders are. You need to see them there, whether that's your parent or a coach or someone. Ideally, we want to see physicians be there. But if you're going to a physician who's not there themselves or don't believe in that, then you're not going to get there if you're under that care of that particular person. And so I think for me, getting onto this other side of this spectrum now ushers me in as a leader to my patients and the people that I serve, to be able to come to this direction here. But I was never there before. Didn't know that I wasn't there before. And I thought that I was doing much better than what I actually was. And then I realized I was on this side of the paradigm here. And I think my journey going through illness and things really helped me to see all of that and come to this other side.
Yeah. I'm curious to know what do you feel like the top 3 or 4 things were that you did, and retrospectively, that you feel moved the needle enough that really got you into that, oh my gosh, I'm actually optimally, like I'm in that 8, 9, 10 area as opposed to 3, 4, 5 or lower. Like, what do you think those things were for you?
One of the biggest thing was mindset. So I had about 2 to 3 years of combing through. I asked myself the question, how did I get here?
Yeah.
What are all the factors that got me here? I'm gonna take my screen down. What are all the factors that got here? Certainly it was childhood things. Certainly it was growing up and not seeing models, seeing people sick. But on the other hand, because I saw so many people sick, it's what birthed in me this profound need to really deal with sickness. Um, and I thought about going through medical school, how much I had been brainwashed in medical school to how to think about healing, how to think about illness, how to think about wellness. I had to deconstruct some beliefs that I had about that as well, which was very difficult, I think, to kind of deconstruct a lot of what I had been taught, how I understood people, how I understood quality of life and things of that nature. I also had to deal with people who were my leaders who were not well themselves and how that was impacting me and how I was internalizing their spirit and their nature and habits. And I had to really distance myself from some people. It's not a bad thing. It's just where I saw myself going. I had to be mindful who my leaders were and I had to change leadership. Um, I also am a believer and I'm Christian, and I had to think about how being in the church system led me to have some toxic beliefs that were not conducive to my healing and recovery, which was a bizarre realization to come to. That on the one hand, medicine talks a lot about being healthy, and the church system talks a lot about healing, but the two are different and don't crosstalk very well. And so I had to figure out how to pursue healing and to be healthy and merge those two worlds, which was not easy feat to undergo. So I think one of the biggest things for me was mindset, um, deconstructing how I got here, what sort of beliefs and behaviors were I still exhibiting that continued me on that path, who were my friends and circles and leadership, and what kind of new community was I going to be creating to allow me to be sustained to sustain myself. Nancy Boyd Franklin is a family therapist, and I called her some years ago when I moved to New Jersey. And I asked, she's a Black family therapist, and I said, what advice will you give me coming up in the field that would help me be successful? She said, get you a professional family. I said, what do you mean by that? She said, when we're growing up, we have our family of origin that helps the baby come along. And then as we get older, we develop other families to nurture other identities that we begin to merge into. And she said, as you where you are now, you need to get a professional family. You need to get a Black professional family. You need a family for every identity that you're trying to nurture. And
Mm.
that stuck with me. So I have a family for every sort of aspect of my life. I have a church family, I have a holistic family, I have a psychiatric family, I have, functional medicine family, I have environmental medicine family, I have my family of origin. I have all these different families nurturing all these different identities in me. I didn't have that before. I was
Mm.
trying to have the people in my life that have always been there be these things that they weren't, be families or communities to me that they couldn't, and to support different aspects of me that they couldn't. So I began to see my growth progress when I started making those shifts and transitions.
Wow, what great advice, and how great that you took it. In our community, we talk a lot about, finding your healing team and, being really selective. It's not personal that I don't just want to, hang out with someone who's toxic. It's that I need to create a healing team so that I can ooch my way towards that 8, 9, 10 side of the spectrum, right? What do they say? You're like a composite of the top 5 people you spend the most time with. That was sort of, my daughter sort of heard that. One of her brothers said that several years ago, and she was like, oh my gosh, like, who am I hanging out with? Like, those aren't the people I actually want to be more like. So it's an empowering thing, I think, to realize you can actually choose your secondary family. You're not family of origin, as you said, but you're all the people that meet all the other needs. That's really cool. So talk to me a little bit about this intersection between mental health and cognitive health and physical health. You and I were talking a little bit about this before the podcast, and you had some really interesting things to say. I wonder if we could delve into that next.
Yeah, I think that, I have been coming up, you know, in the mental health field. I'm a board certified and an allopathically trained psychiatrist. And I then so I was taught all about, basic psychiatry. And then I was taught, hey, if you really want to be a good psychiatrist, you need to do what the old guard used to do and get training in psychoanalysis. And so I spent, over 10 years in psychoanalytic training, both adult and child psychoanalytic training. I learned a lot about development, about conflicts, about the ego and how the mind works from a meta psychological perspective. Um, and I thought if you just did all those sort of things and built up this sort of way we think about mental health and supports and having your you going to yoga and you dance and you have good socialization, you'll just be mentally strong and things of that nature. And you do your therapy. And no, it's not that. Those things are all good, but your mental health, I began to learn through this process, is a function of your entire physical body, and it's a function of your environment as well. And it's the interplay between those forces that really dictate your mental health. And so you can have the best support, best loving parents, the best team in place, but if you don't live in a very nice or good quality environment, if you don't have, the best physical health overall, you're going to have some challenges. And I think that we have separated the mind and the body, and I think that's a tragedy. And we talk about that a lot. So what does that mean that we've done that? But we not only have separated the mind and the body, we also have separated the body from the environment. When you go into your doctor, for example, the doctors almost never ask you about where you live, what water you drink, what food you eat, what soil are you getting your food from, what's your air quality in your home or in your environment. Almost never ask if you've been hiking and been bitten by a tick or anything of that sort, because we've come to see that disease is not influenced by the environment, is influenced by genes and all these other sort of things. Um, and I think that's a tragedy. And so I think what for me in working with patients and people who are listening is that your mental health is a composite of your physical health, your brain health, your environmental health, your social health, your occupational health, your financial health. It's all of those things that coming together that becomes the anchor of your what we call mental health. And if any one of those strands are disrupted or taken out, you can crumble. It doesn't matter that you had a really great childhood and upbringing. If I was just to snatch your physical health from you right now, your childhood can be irrelevant. But then on the other hand, if you had a really poor upbringing, doesn't mean that the rest of your life is going to be challenging, because those other things matter as well. And I think that is really key for people to understand that interplay. And then when we're talking about how to build a stronger mind, we need to look at all those intersections.
Yeah, and I guess I'm curious to know, do your patients who are coming to you feel like they resonate with this when you ask those questions? Are they surprised, or are they, yeah, this is an issue for me, and they see the connection right away?
Some do, some don't. And the ones that do great, we can just take on and keep building and working it out. And then some don't, and we need to build it up. And it can take them, a couple of years to really put all these sort of pieces in place to, to appreciate that interplay.
Yeah. Dr. Daniel Amen, you know him, of course, I'm sure, the Brain MD supplement and also the Amen clinics. He has said, I think it's what the way he says it is like, mental health, mental illness is a physical illness that steals your mind. It steals your mind. And I think that gets to what you're saying here, which is that, mental illness doesn't come from nowhere. And often there are these underpinnings in the various, dimensions that you talked about. What are the top kind of 3 or 4 things that you see as kind of root culprits for people's mental health challenges in your practice?
Number one on the list is the lack of repair or the inability to understand repair or the challenge to repair or not having seen repair. So let me break that down. It's not so much what people have gone through, experience. It's not so much the injury that they have incurred. It's not so much the trauma that has resulted at the hands of a cataclysmic, horrifying event. The central issue is how do we move to a place of repair from the severance, from the rupture, from the injury? And those that believe in repair know how to seek repair, know how to find and sustain and obtain repair will do better. And those that don't will suffer. This is an evolutionary concept of um, around survival of the fittest. It's not the strong, it's not the wisest, not the smartest, it's the one that can adjust and adapt that will go on. And I think that what I see for many people, some just don't believe in repair. They will say things like, I'm just going to be like this for the rest of my life.
Mm.
That belief is so potent. And unless they can shift their belief, it doesn't matter what medicine I give them, what service I give them. That belief is so potent, it can really derail and unravel a lot of things. And I will say that will be number one on the list is there's injury and repair. That concept needs to be understood. Now, we we might jump off the bed and we might fall and injure ourselves. We'll take the risk and do that because we believe and know consciously and unconsciously that if an injury occurs because of that, we'll likely can repair from that. So we'll take that risk and we'll have that fun. We'll jump off the bed. We're less likely to jump off a 100-foot building, from there. Why? Because we believe that if we get injured, it's going to hurt really badly. It's going to also be very difficult to recover. And so we make decisions based on repair and recovery. And we may not be conscious of that. But when it comes to healing, those that really believe in repair and recovery, in relationships, the relationships that survive and move on past conflict are those that really pursue repair and recovery. And that is essential. Number two, belief systems around fighting, that I can fight my way to healing. Fighting is a survival tactic. It's a sympathetic drive state. It is the body producing a lot of adrenaline and cortisol and things of that nature. And it's a dysfunctional vagal system or parasympathetic system. Those that believe they can fight into healing, into wellness, will not get there. It's not possible. And so I think that is a challenge for people. The other sort of belief is I can do it all by myself and I don't need anybody. Healing happens in relationships. It's not so much the medicine that I'm giving you, it's the medicine I'm giving you in the relationship that's making it do what it does. And it's that interplay. And because we can't quite see and measure relationships that way, we can undermine the importance of them. Outside of that sort of belief structure, I see, heavy metals, molds, Lyme, um, significant trauma, and um, chemicals are like the top 5 denizens that are very impactful to people. Bartonella and babesiosis is also on that list that's very impactful. Certain viruses, obviously like COVID, um, and EMF, toxicity, and things like multiple chemical sensitivities and things of that as well. I think those are some of the top 5 and top 10 I would round out on a biochemical level.
Mhm. And what about when there's both? Like, what about when there's a mindset issue around, I can't heal until get out of the mold. I have to move from my house in order to heal. that seems to sort of bring a lot of like both the biochemical toxins and also the mindset into play. Do you see people be able to shift that and still be exposed to these things, but make improvements anyway?
So I do think there's some truth that one won't be able to fully heal if they're still being exposed to mold and mycotoxins. Whether or not they can improve some, I think depending on how it's hitting them, they can improve some. So for those who are chemically sensitive and their bodies have shifted into um, um, an allergy response. So there's three parts of mold toxicity. So you have the toxicity from the mycotoxins, then you have the allergies to the molds and things of that nature, and then you have the sensitivity and the chemical sensitivity that can kind of emerge out of it. And I think though that latter group, the more sensitive they become, the more difficult it is, and that person needs to leave ASAP. But the person that hasn't happened in and they just experiencing toxicity, a lot of times they can improve still in the environment before they get out of it. And I certainly kind of think it depends on how we strategize those groups.
Yeah, yeah. Cool. So, tell me a little bit about parents, because I know you see kids and adults. I know you see kids with PANS and PANDAS. I know you've written a chapter in a book on, the impact of disability on parents, right? In particular, fathers. And I just wonder if you'd speak to this because so many people in my community do have kids on the spectrum or who are dealing with brain injuries, or who have, these really debilitating, sometimes mild, sometimes very severe cases of PANS and PANDAS. And it can be a huge, you know, it just becomes a huge obstacle to any kind of normal life on so many levels for people. I wonder what you can tell us about that group in your practice and how you support them and what those folks benefit from.
Yeah, this is a challenging area. In my experience, some cases are successful and some are not. And I think that the cases that are successful have certain features to them. Everybody's on the same page. There is a minimum level of blame. There's everyone feeling that they have a role to play and they're assuming responsibility for their sort of part in the recovery. They're open to getting to the destination and they're not emphasizing the way to get there as much. That there is a faith and trust component that they believe by faith that this is going to work out and they're going to get there. They're trusting each other and they're trusting the providers and the leadership that they're working with. Um, and they're prioritizing this recovery and things for their child. Those are some of the features that I see when the cases are going to be successful. On the other end, when I see parents, for example, sometimes prioritize the child's social life over their healing. And they say things like, no, the child has to go to soccer practice. They can't come to an appointment or make these sort of adjustments. We have to make sure they go to camp or, they have this test coming up and that sort of thing. Or I have to make sure that I keep them in this sort of dance class because they really love dance. And those things are important. Um, I sometimes see those cases not go so well because they're prioritizing the socialization of the child over the physical well-being of the child. And as we said earlier, socialization is a part of one's functionality and what they need, but it can't be top priority. Sometimes I've seen these illnesses and things tear families apart. They're at each other's throats. The parents don't, one parent doesn't believe, the other parent do. Um, they don't want to do certain treatments, or maybe they have money but they don't want to invest, they don't think it's worth it, but they'll take that same money and put into a child's education. They'll take $55,000 and pay for a private education, but not take $2,000 and buy a test that the kid may need or something like that. And so when I see education also being promoted along with socialization, the infighting, there's going to be challenges. I think when I see congenital problems, I see early difficulty between the parents and particularly the mother and child. And I see the child say something like this: my mother is to blame for all of my problems. When I hear that, it took me a while to kind of begin to decode that that is oftentimes a sign of congenital problems that started in utero. And I began to keen in on that as a possibility when I would work with kids and I would work with the parents. I was like, man, this parent is just lovely. I don't really see the problem with this parent, the way this kid is spelling it out to me. Like, I don't understand the hatred and the disconnect. This parent seems loving, they're attentive, and they're present, and they're trying to do whatever they need to do. I can't understand it. It was when I started to hear kids say, I feel like the best thing for me to do is to go back up into my mother's womb and start over.
Mm.
I said, huh, that's a very interesting statement. And it took me a while to start decoding, and then I realized, huh, this child is unconsciously expressing that the warfare started in utero. And why the parent can't pinpoint why this kid hates them so much is because it's not the parent itself, it was the condition in the parent that the kid is having a problem with. And because they don't have language to express it, it's just onslaught of hostility and attacks toward the parent, particularly the mother. The other side of that I've noticed is when the parent has this immense guilt and feeling completely responsible for the child. Sometimes the parent has actively done something like drinking while pregnant or something like that. But aside from that, this is also, I think, at times unconscious recognition in the parent that this is a congenital sort of contribution. It's when the guilt is just insurmountably difficult to overcome. And I think there's a recognition there. Those are some more challenge. Those are challenging situations where I think it takes a lot more work, a lot more time, and this recovery is going to be kind of be long drawn out before this kid and family can recover.
Wow, that's so insightful. And I'm hearing congenital contribution, and my mind goes to things like congenital Lyme and co-infections, mold toxins, living in mold when the mom was pregnant, obviously heavy metals. I think Klinghardt has said like 2/3 of mom's mercury burden goes into her firstborn child. So I think those are the places my mind goes. What else are you talking about when you say congenital contributions?
So infections, toxins, I think are definitely key. Um, the disruption of those toxins on the mitochondria, in particular, as you know, the mitochondria DNA passes from mother to child. So mitochondrial damage and dysfunction passes on to the child, is another contribution. Certainly, those things can impact epigenetics, the idea of how the DNA can be influenced modified, that can be passed along too because of the sort of burden in the mother. And then rhythms, so the mother's circadian rhythms, the mother's chemistries, um, and I think also play a role. So for example, if the mother was nocturnal or worked the night shift, how that impacts the child's circadian rhythms and things of that nature plays a role. So it's a lot of things that can be passed from the mother to the child that I think is worthy of thinking about in an assessment and trying to understand the parent-child dynamic. So when mother and child are having a hard time getting along, I think these are some of the conversations I like to have with them. And if we can move, for example, the child to a place of understanding that some of this is not mother's fault.
Right.
It did happen through the maternal child bond, but it's not mother's conscious inducement and attempt to harm you, but you did get harmed in the process.
Does that shift things for kids, do you find, to just bring that to light and have the conversation and essentially let them know that their complaint, their what they were trying to convey, even without maybe knowing it unconsciously, has been heard? Does that change things usually for
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah.
Be- because some of the suffering that we have is not so much, there are three groups of suffering. So the one that knows what's going on, the one's confused about what's going on, and the one that doesn't know what's going on. Those are three different groups. The one that's confused about what's going on, who think it's one thing when it's not, is the group that suffers more than the other two groups.
Hmm.
And so if we can bring back into alignment an accurate ideal about what's going on and line it up more accurately with the reality and truth, that handles a lot of the suffering before you even resolve the underlying problem.
Yeah. Which is again kind of getting to the mindset piece, or what I would call like the conceptual limb of your tree, the part of you that tells stories and has understanding that can either forward your goals or kind of be obstacles.
Absolutely.
So interesting. So what haven't we talked about that you feel would be important for this population? Again, many of whom in my audience have kids who struggle or who've struggled themselves with even if it's not sort of frank mental illness diagnoses, right? Like depression, anxiety, OCD, panic, those sorts of things, but who have a lot of cognitive issues. And there's obviously a big overlap there. What else haven't we said to that group that you'd like to say?
Um, that's a really good question. What else would I say about this group? I do think that all the things that we're talking about are contributors to two particular issues. One is developmental progression, and that this became interest in the heart of mine when I got into psychoanalysis, and particularly child psychoanalysis, where we learned a lot about child psychological, emotional, relational development. And why I'm so passionate about this is because the things we're talking about disrupts and interrupts development. And what matters to me as a physician, as a clinician, as a spirit-led person, is that before I die, I want to unfold and develop to the maximum of where I'm supposed to be or what I can. I don't know what that is, but I'm open to it. And I want to make sure that I deal with any of these interrupters and disruptors to that process. And for people, I think sometime who become content with leaving some of these things in their body or not addressing them or thinking that maybe a kid is going to grow out of them or something like that, it doesn't work that way. And that we can, in some ways, stunt the growth of a person by not addressing these interrupters. And I think that's an important thing for parents and children and adolescents to be thinking about, that development is the most important thing that we're trying to facilitate here, and that you get to where you need to be in your developmental milestones, because if you don't and you're stunted or you're arrested or you're delayed, then the next stage of development is coming with its own set of struggles and challenges that you're going to need to master. And if you haven't gotten this level of mastery under your belt, then the next level of mastery is going to be even more challenging. It's going to be compounded. And then you're going to be thinking at the age of 45, 50, how did I get here and why am I struggling with the things I'm struggling with? The second part of that is cognition. It's not just about feeling good, it's also about being better. And in order to be better and not just feel better, you have to have intact cognition, because processing is key. And that is one of the big things that's disruptive for everybody involved in this sort of thing, is the trouble with processing. How do you take one thought and synthesize and make another thought? Or how do you take a step back and reflect on a moment? Or how do you decide to, you know, because go in one direction over the other? That's sort of cognitive processing you need. And you also needed to regulate your emotions and to process through traumas and things of that nature. And so I think we need to not leave that apart. And so one of the aims that I made toward here in my practice is about the TMS machine. Stands for transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is the idea of taking a magnet, sending an electrical current through it, creating a magnetic field, and then placing it over the brain to stimulate the electrical activity in the brain to move nerves in a certain pattern to try to rewire cognitive arrhythmias, and so that you can straighten out the brain waves and the person can think more clearly. That we need more neuromodulation after all the onslaught of toxicity. Once we've gotten that eradicated and detox and we've repaired things, one of the essential things we need is something to bring all our brain waves back into um, accordance with one another, much like a conductor does at a symphony. Because otherwise, how are we going to navigate the world if we're not being very clear in our cognition?
Wow. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that particular modality, because it's not something I'm aware of it. I've heard of it. I've never used it. And I have some questions about it. For example, I mean, the brain is so complex, right? Millions, trillions of neurons doing different things. How do you know that what you're doing isn't going to take it in the wrong direction?
Yeah. So, um, this field is evolving, and it's still in its infancy in terms of the rich understanding. The first TMS machine that was made public to be used. The prototype was 1985, but the technology goes all the way back into the 1800s with Michael Faraday. And those earlier versions obviously weren't really all that effective. And so since 1985, the technology has been improving ever since. I think that we're now able to couple with this imaging studies, QEEGs, functional MRIs, and we can also use PET and SPEC as well to kind of examine what's going on in the brain before and during and after treatment. Obviously, that can be costly for some people, and we can't roll this out for everybody in the way that we wish because of cost. But we can measure what's going on, and we can get a sense by using these imaging studies, which a functional MRI is the most sensitive that we can use to track sort of how the brain is moving. We can look at networks of the brain, and it's not just that the brain waves are just moving in some sort of way. There's networks and there's a sophistication to how they organize and move in certain sections. And so understanding how those sections move, whether or not they need to be stimulated, inhibited, different things of that nature, where you're going to put the probe on the brain, is all what we're on as ongoing studies to kind of perfect as much as possible. But we still have some really good insights now how to go about it, and we can see some change. Now, what example can I give you that lays this out the most? Autism. Uh, as early as 2 and 3 years old, we can take TMS and apply it to a patient with autism, and we can see something as clear as quick in the first 2 to 3 weeks. A child goes from not talking to talking. Child
Okay,
goes from
so a lot of people are going to hear that and they're going to be like, "Oh my God, I'm either signing up to come see you right away, or that's BS. That can't possibly." So break that down a little bit more. How is that even possible?
So what we see so autism is a heterogeneous population, okay? So every patient that has autism has the autistic phenotype, and then there's subphenotypes. Some that talk and some doesn't. Some that has, really high IQ and some don't. Some that has emotional dysregulation, some don't. So all patients with autism are not the same. So they're not going to all respond the same. And the reason why one might have an autistic presentation, how much of that is toxicity, how much of that is infection, how much of that is immune dysregulation, how much of that is immune deficiencies, how much of that is not having your immune cofactors in place, your folates, your B12s, your vitamin D, how much of that is the gut microbiome contributing where you have overgrowth of Clostridia, how much of it is mycotoxin and mold. So it's all these different denizens that are at play. They all converge to some degree on neuronal tissue and largely in the brain. Many of these toxins love fat tissue, and the brain is pretty fatty. So that's why it's one of the central areas that's hit and with these sort of problems. And what we're trying to do here is, because the child is so young, because the child's brain is not formed and solid in place, and none of our brains are, all brains are movable. That's what neuroscience is now teaching, that once we get 25, it's not the end of the road. But because their brains are still moving, and so the neuroplasticity is still there, we can see quicker improvements in these kids. So when you take a magnetic probe and you're stimulating the electrical brain, you start to get these nerve cells that are kind of dormant, if you will, and they're not able to move, and they're kind of stuck to some degree. And the magnetic probe starts to infuse energy into it, wakes them up. And the ways it works is by increasing, for example, neurotransmitters, increasing mitochondrial activity. It starts increasing blood flow, start increasing stem cell production, etc. We start reducing inflammation. And this is some of the mechanisms behind why it's working, and the brain starts moving in a different direction. What we know in autism is that there are suppressed neurotransmitter activity. We know that there's mitochondrial dysfunction. We know that there's poor blood flow, high inflammation, poor antioxidant support. And so by infusing those things both orally in and then stimulating that production with the TMS, we can see improvements in these kids with autism.
So it's basically a jump start to neuroplasticity is what it sounds like. Are there any kids with autism or even adults with other brain issues who should not explore TMS?
Should not.
Like, what are the contraindications?
So, I mean, obviously, if there are active seizure issues, active, mania or active psychosis, any sort of active state, it's not the best time to be doing it. And after there's sort of remission, you should consider and use with caution. If there are certain implantable devices and things, metal and things of the nature, because it's a magnet, um, there's going to be some contraindications there. Um, you can kind of you weigh it a little bit more with people who are pregnant. There's a pro versus pro and con sort of analysis. But I can't think of anybody that you should absolutely not use it because just of their dysfunction, but there's these sort of other sort of aspects.
Cool. And I'm guessing this is something they come to your office to do. Is that right? Or are there wearables or anything else they can do at home to continue this treatment?
So yes, in the version that I have, you come to my office, there are newer technologies coming out now. There's the device is going to be smaller, going to be more portable. The ones that people have at their home are not as strong and can generate enough force. And then some of these devices need a fan on it to kind of cool it down because it heats up. So some of those home devices and things can't do that. But there are some neuromodulation devices people can use at home. Is just not as strong, and it takes a longer time and less improvement, but you can get some improvement from them.
Gotcha. So if people wanted to work with you and explore some of these modalities, would they just contact you at your practice, which is New Image Wellness, right, in New Jersey?
Yes, I am in name of my practice is New Image Wellness. I'm in New Jersey. I'm a solo practitioner here. I'm in Marlton, New Jersey, more specifically, and I run a functional integrative neuropsychiatric practice where I work with chronic complex illness on the one arm, and then also do basic sort of treatments for people as well who are not in that sort of armor treatment or not yet convinced that they should be.
Gotcha. So pretty much everyone on the spectrum who needs what you provide. Cool. So we will put a link to that for sure in the show notes so people can follow up. Anything else that we didn't shine light on that you wanted to do before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I have the name of that author, and I have one other thing that I would um, mention.
Cool.
Um, I I am a big proponent of one thing we didn't mention or talk about was our hormones. And what I found in treating these chronic complex illnesses, many people have their hormones that are out of balance, and it makes the treatment very difficult. The one that I'm very passionate about right now is thyroid hormone. There's a lot of misconception about it and a lot of lack of education about how it works and how to go about optimizing it. And I just want to put the plug out there that I think this is something we should talk more about, and how do we get thyroid levels in balance optimally, because it is regulating so many things. And the thing that we care most about in all of this treatment is the mitochondria. And the most important treatment of all treatment is oxygen. That the meaning of life is when we breathe oxygen, and the meaning of death is when we stop processing oxygen. And the thing that's going to regulate oxygen the most is thyroid hormone, by regulating it at the mitochondria, which is the central place where oxygen is working. And so thyroid hormone is responsible for boosting the mitochondria and building more, regulating the number of cristae that it has, how the mitochondria is going to function, how they recruit each other, etc. And so I think that I've seen a lot of suboptimal thyroid cases. And when I made that big push in my practice, patients started responding a lot better to all the other sort of treatments. So I just want to kind of put that plug out there. How important thyroid hormone is the hormone of vitality. And if we don't want to be looking like these shows that come on TV, like The Walking Dead, we need to work on our thyroid hormone so we stop looking like zombies walking around.
Yeah. So basically, when you see someone in the supermarket who looks like The Walking Dead, you're like, thyroid issue,
it's a,
mitochondria.
it's type of
A little bit like that. No, I'm that way too. So, okay, well, that's a big can of worms that I kind of want to delve into. We only have 10 minutes. Do you feel like we can do it justice, or should we do another podcast?
to talk specifically about that. We definitely need more time. We
All
can
right.
we can maximize the little time we have left, but we definitely need more.
Yeah, no, well, then let's pause it and let's table it because I think we haven't had that conversation yet on the Healing Grove podcast, and it would be awesome if you would share your thoughts on it. I mean, I think for starters, the people should just know that the labs and studies that your doctor are likely ordering if you're going to a standard allopathic doctor are not adequately assessing your thyroid. So just getting a TSH or thyroid stimulating hormone, which is what most doctors do, if anything, when you say you're tired or your hair is falling out, or you feel like The Walking Dead, is definitely not enough. And maybe we could just leave it at that until we have a chance to really round out that conversation. Because you're right, it's a
Absolutely.
huge issue. Huge.
All right. And the last thing is I did get the name of that author.
Cool.
All right. Her name is Dorothy Roberts.
Okay.
I'm going to share my screen here. She's written several books here. One is called Killing the Black Body, and the other is Fatal Invention. And the subtitle there is, let's see, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. And in this book, she walks through all of the sort of racialized medicine concepts and its origins and its implications today and how it's influencing medicine and people's sort of thoughts about themselves and how they interface with the medical system.
Perfect. So helpful. So we'll link to both of those, and I really appreciate those resources. Thank you for sharing them.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, Dr. Chris Winfrey. Thank you so much for being willing to share your thoughts with us and your expertise and talk us through some of these very complex things, but with such clear analogies, metaphors, and images. It's been really, really helpful.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this on some of the things I've done several other podcasts and some of the things we've been able to get into here with you. I think it's a product of your work and your nature and your spirit. And I can sense a very difference here with some of the other podcasts. So I very much appreciate being able to get into the humanness here with you. And because we can easily talk about the technical biochemical things, but I really appreciated that the most.
Thank you for that feedback. That means a lot to me. All right. Well, have a great rest of your day, and we will hopefully see you again for more on thyroid health.
Absolutely.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Healing Grove podcast. If you liked it, please be sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to deepen your experience further, consider grabbing a copy of the Healing Grove playbook. With journal prompts for this podcast and 41 others, it's the perfect place to record your learnings, keep track of the tools you explore, and reflect on your own experience. Finally, it's important to mention that even though I am a doctor, nothing you hear on this podcast, whether from myself or my guests, constitutes medical advice. Any intervention you try should always be discussed with and supervised by a trusted member of your own healing team. Thanks for listening, and see you next time in the Healing Grove.